I am Stella, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant who specializes in tracking missing millions and uncovering devastating corporate fraud. I never expected the biggest fraud I would ever investigate to be my own marriage to a man I trusted completely. The day after my wedding, I received an urgent call from the private clinic where my husband and I had gone for a routine checkup. Suddenly, the doctor lowered his voice to almost a whisper, telling me they found something very unusual, and I needed to see it myself. He told me to come immediately and come alone. He said no matter what happens, do not say a single word to your husband. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your true value and your self-worth. It was a rainy Sunday morning in downtown Chicago. The luxury hotel suite still smelled like the expensive champagne from our wedding reception the night before. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city skyline while my new husband Preston was singing in the shower. Preston was 35 years old. He was an investment director from a prominent old money family who expected nothing less than absolute perfection. To his family and mine, our union was the ultimate merger of wealth and status. To me, it was supposed to be the start of a quiet, secure life. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. The caller ID showed the name of our exclusive fertility clinic. Preston and I had frozen embryos there a few months prior as an insurance policy before the wedding chaos began. I answered the call expecting a generic billing question from the receptionist. Instead, I heard the strained voice of Dr. Eris Thorne. He was the senior partner at the clinic and a man who usually communicated through a wall of cheerful professionalism. Today, his tone was completely different. "Stella," he said quietly, "are you in a place where you can speak freely?" I glanced toward the bathroom door, listening to the sound of the running water. "Yes, I am alone right now. I need you to come to the clinic right away," Dr. Thorne said. His breathing sounded slightly ragged over the line. "We were finalizing your genetic screening files this morning and we found a severe discrepancy. You need to look at these documents in person." I frowned. "A discrepancy with the embryos. Can you just email me the lab report?" "No," he replied sharply. The urgency in his voice sent a sudden chill down my spine. "I cannot put this in an email. Come immediately. Come alone. And Stella, do not say a single word about this to Preston." The line went dead. My analytical brain, the same brain that hunted down shell companies and traced hidden offshore accounts, immediately shifted into high gear. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I threw on a gray sweater and jeans, leaving my diamond engagement ring sitting next to the hotel notepad. I scribbled a quick message telling Preston I went out to grab us some special coffee and slipped out of the room before the shower turned off. The drive to the clinic took exactly 14 minutes. The streets were quiet, but my pulse was hammering against my ribs. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the facility, the reception area was completely empty. Dr. Thorne was waiting for me in the hallway. He did not offer his usual warm handshake. He just motioned for me to follow him into his private office and locked the door behind us. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. He looked deeply uncomfortable, running a hand through his graying hair. He pushed a manila folder across the polished wood surface. I opened it and found a standard legal form from the clinic. It was a request for the immediate destruction of our frozen embryos. At the bottom was my signature, right next to Preston's signature. It was dated from 3 days ago. "I did not sign this," I said flatly. My voice was steady, but my hands gripped the edges of the folder tightly. "Someone forged my signature." Dr. Thorne nodded slowly. "I suspected as much." "Preston came in personally on Thursday afternoon to submit the paperwork. He claimed you were too busy with wedding preparations to come in yourself. Because the request seemed abrupt, I decided to run a final internal audit on your file. That is when I found the second issue." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another document. This one was a laboratory printout. "As you know, your sister Whitney also uses our facility. She came in for routine blood work last week to confirm her new pregnancy. Our system automatically flags potential genetic overlap for safety protocols. The cross-match results came back this morning. He pushed the paper toward me. I stared at the bold black letters on the page. The biological father of Whitney's child was Preston. My 30-year-old sister, the spoiled former pageant queen who spent money like water and constantly craved attention, was pregnant with my husband's baby. They had been sleeping together while I was planning my wedding. Preston tried to destroy our embryos, to erase his commitment to me because he was already tied to the golden child of my family. I stood up. I did not cry. Instead, a cold, calculated fury settled over my entire body. My hands were shaking not from tears, but from pure, unfiltered rage. Just as I reached the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from my mother, Beverly. Post-wedding family brunch in 20 minutes. Do not be late and embarrass us again. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My name is Stella, and the message from my mother glared back at me from the screen. Post-wedding family brunch in 20 minutes. Do not be late and embarrass us again. I shoved the phone in my pocket and left the clinic. The drive to my parents' estate took 20 minutes. My mind was racing, connecting the data points like I did in every financial audit I ran. Preston forging documents. Whitney pregnant. A betrayal so deep it felt like a physical blow. I refused to break. I parked my car in the circular driveway, pushed open the unlocked doors, and walked straight toward the dining room. When I stepped directly into the dining room, the polite laughter stopped. The mahogany table was laden with imported caviar and vintage champagne. My father Richard sat at the head of the table. My mother Beverly sat to his right. Directly across from her sat my younger sister Whitney. She was glowing, sipping orange juice instead of mimosas, wearing a smug smile that told me she knew exactly what I had just discovered. "You are late, Stella," my mother said, not bothering to look up as she adjusted her napkin. "Your wedding was yesterday. The least you could do is pretend to care about the family today." I did not say a word. I walked straight to the table, pulled the forged destruction request and the DNA laboratory printout from my bag, and slammed them down directly on top of my mother's bone china plate. The papers slid across the smooth surface, stopping right in front of Whitney. "Explain this," I demanded. My voice was dangerously calm. Whitney glanced at the papers, then looked at my mother. There was no gasp of shock. There was no tearful denial. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifyingly cold. My father simply picked up his white coffee cup and took a slow sip, his face completely devoid of surprise. My own mother set down her champagne flute. She picked up the DNA results, glanced at them with mild annoyance, and pushed them aside. "You always had to be so dramatic, Stella. Dr. Thorne should have known better than to let you see those. We pay him enough to handle things discreetly." "You knew," I stated. The reality of it slammed into my chest. "You all knew." "Of course we knew," Beverly scoffed. She leaned back, looking at me with absolute disdain. "You really thought Preston married you for love? Do not be naive. You are a dry, 33-year-old spreadsheet calculator. You spend your weekends analyzing tax codes. Men like Preston do not fall in love with women like you." I stared at her, the woman who was supposed to protect me, casually dismantling my entire existence. "Then why did he marry me?" My father answered me, his voice laced with pure business practicality. Preston's late grandfather set up an ironclad trust fund. It stipulated that Preston would not receive his $50 million inheritance unless he married a self-made, educated professional before his 35th birthday. He needed a prop, Stella. You have a flawless resume. You were the perfect candidate to unlock the trust. I looked at Whitney, who was now casually buttering a croissant. "And you were just fine with sharing him." Whitney offered a sweet, poisonous smile. "I am not sharing him, Stella. I get the baby, and as of next week I get the man. You were just a temporary necessity. Plus, Preston's family would never accept a former pageant queen with no college degree as the primary wife to unlock the estate. We needed your credentials to secure the bag. You did your job perfectly." My mother chimed in, her tone entirely devoid of empathy. Whitney deserves Preston's genes and his lifestyle. She is beautiful, vibrant, and actually knows how to host a dinner party. You were a convenient stepping stone for everyone involved. Preston gets his 50 million, Whitney gets her dream family, and our clinic secures the financial backing we need for our upcoming merger. It is a win for everyone. You should be very happy you could finally contribute something useful to this family. The sheer calculation of it all left me momentarily breathless. They had weaponized my entire life, my education, my late nights studying, my unblemished professional reputation just to serve Whitney and Preston. They had treated my marriage, the vows I took yesterday, as a corporate transaction. The heavy oak double doors of the dining room swung open. Preston strolled in, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked perfectly relaxed, carrying a fresh mimosa. He stopped when he saw me standing there, then glanced at the laboratory papers scattered across the table. He did not flinch. He did not look guilty. He simply sighed loudly, just like a man annoyed that his flight had been delayed by 10 minutes. "I told Thorne to shred those," Preston muttered, stepping up to the table. He set his drink down. "You forged my signature to destroy our embryos," I said, my voice finally cracking with the weight of his betrayal. "You used me." Preston looked me dead in the eyes. His gaze was entirely empty of the warmth he had faked for the last 2 years. "It was just business, Stella. Nothing personal. I needed the ring on your finger for 24 hours to satisfy the estate lawyers. The trust clears tomorrow morning." He set down his glass, reached for his left hand, and smoothly pulled off his solid gold wedding band. Without a second of hesitation, he dropped it directly into my half-full champagne glass. The heavy ring hit the bottom with a sharp clink, sending a splash of golden liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Consider this my formal resignation from this marriage," Preston said smoothly. "Now I believe you have some packing to do today." I watched the heavy gold ring settle at the very bottom of my crystal glass. Tiny bubbles clung to the metallic surface, providing a perfectly tragic metaphor for the hollow and deceptive promise it represented. Preston simply adjusted the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, his face an unreadable mask of absolute elite entitlement. "I want an annulment filed by tomorrow morning," he said, his voice flat, cold, and entirely authoritative. "My lawyers will send over the preliminary paperwork before noon. Do not make this difficult for yourself, Stella. You know perfectly well that you do not have the financial resources or the social capital to fight my family in a courtroom." I looked away from the submerged ring and stared directly into his perfectly symmetrical, emotionless face. "You are standing here demanding a swift annulment right after using me to secure a $50 million trust fund. I am demanding that you pack your bags immediately," he sneered, leaning just close enough so that I could smell the expensive designer cologne I had purchased for him for our rehearsal dinner. "I am giving you exactly 2 hours to clear your cheap clothes out of the downtown penthouse. It is my territory now. Do not leave a single trace of yourself behind." I squared my shoulders, refusing to shrink under his arrogant gaze. "You do not own that penthouse, Preston." Before he could even process my response, a heavy hand slammed down on the mahogany dining table, rattling the crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Jamal, Whitney's husband, pushed his way to the front of the room. Jamal was a luxury real estate broker who always dressed like he was stepping onto a magazine cover. Today, he wore a bespoke charcoal suit and a solid gold watch that cost more than most people's residential homes. He had always hated me, viewing my quiet, analytical nature as a direct insult to the flashy, excessively loud lifestyle he and Whitney carefully curated for their social media followers. Jamal stepped directly into my personal space, using his formidable height to physically intimidate me. He aggressively blocked my path to Preston, his dark eyes flashing with a sickening mixture of triumph and absolute contempt. "You heard the man drop out," Jamal said, his voice booming aggressively across the vast dining room. "Pack your bags and get out." I held my ground, even though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. "Keep your hands off this, Jamal. This conversation is strictly between me and the man who just admitted to impregnating your wife." Jamal let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the mansion. He actually glanced back at Whitney, who gave him a small, validating nod of approval from her seat. "You really think I care about your pathetic, jealous drama, Stella? You think a fake piece of paper from some obscure medical clinic is going to derail my life. You are completely delusional. He stepped even closer, invading my space entirely and forcing me to look up at him. Let me spell it out for you, since you have always been a little slow to catch on to how the real world operates. Richard and Beverly are signing a $50 million merger for their clinic chain on Friday. That deal elevates this entire family into a tax bracket you cannot even begin to comprehend. We are entering a new financial stratosphere, and you are nothing but dead weight trying to drag us back down. He reached out with lightning speed and snatched my leather purse right off the dining table. Before I could stop him, he shoved his hand inside the main compartment and pulled out the keycard to my Tesla. "Give that back to me," I demanded, my voice hardening into steel. Jamal dangled the sleek black keycard just out of my reach, a cruel and predatory smile spreading across his handsome face. "You do not get the car, Stella. Richard co-signed the loan for that vehicle when you were just a struggling student. It stays right here on the property." "That is an absolute lie," I fired back immediately. "I paid off the entirety of that loan 2 years ago. That car belongs solely to me." Jamal simply tossed the keycard to one of the estate security guards standing at attention by the doorway. "Not anymore, it does not. We are certainly not letting you drive off and crash it into a tree in a fit of hysterical feminine rage. You are unstable. You have always been highly unstable. That is exactly why you dropped out of medical school, to play around with spreadsheets. You could not handle the pressure of real success, and now you are desperately trying to ruin Whitney's moment because you are incredibly bitter." My mother Beverly chimed in from her seat at the head of the long table. "Jamal is absolutely right, Stella. You are acting completely unhinged right now. We have a massive press week ahead of us, and we will not allow your petty grievances to tarnish our corporate image. Get an Uber and leave us in peace." I looked slowly around the grand room, making direct eye contact with each of them. My father, Richard, who had not spoken a single word to defend his own daughter. My mother, who looked at me with undisguised parental disgust. Whitney, who was gently resting a manicured hand on her stomach, already fully embracing the role of the glowing mother-to-be. Preston, who had completely checked out of the conversation and was already texting someone on his phone. And Jamal, the aggressive enforcer of their toxic empire, standing over me like a nightclub bouncer. None of them saw me as a human being. I was a disposable prop, a convenient stepping stone, a designated scapegoat to be casually discarded the exact moment I stopped being useful to their bottom line. Jamal snapped his fingers loudly, signaling the two armed security guards waiting in the marble foyer. "Escort her off the property," Jamal ordered with absolute authority. "If she resists in any way, call the local precinct and have her formally arrested for trespassing." The guardsmen, who had known me since I was a teenager, stepped forward cautiously. They avoided making eye contact with me, their expressions tight, with obvious professional discomfort. One of them gently grasped my left elbow. "Please, miss," he muttered softly under his breath. "Do not make us do this the hard way." I jerked my arm forcefully out of his grasp, my spine snapping perfectly straight. "Do not touch me," I said fiercely. "I am leaving." I picked up my empty purse from the dining table, smoothing down the front of my gray sweater with forced composure. I did not look back at my treacherous family as I walked purposefully out of the dining room. I kept my head held high, my steps measured and perfectly calm, absolutely refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I walked through the grand foyer, past the sweeping double staircase and out the heavy oak front doors. The cool morning air hit my face, providing a sharp and welcome contrast to the suffocating and toxic atmosphere inside the mansion. I walked down the expansive stone driveway, the gravel crunching steadily beneath my shoes, until I reached the massive iron gates that separated my parents' sprawling estate from the rest of the world. The automated gates swung shut behind me with a heavy metallic clang. The sound was incredibly final, absolute and unforgiving. I stood completely alone on the pristine suburban curb. A light drizzle had begun to fall from the gray sky, slowly dampening my hair and shoulders. From the long driveway, I could hear the faint, unmistakable sound of cheerful laughter drifting out from the open dining room windows. They were celebrating their victory. They had successfully discarded the family disappointment, secured the $50 million trust fund for the Golden Child, and aggressively protected their upcoming corporate merger. They truly believed they had won the war. They believed I was simply going to call a cab, go back to my cheap apartment, and cry myself to sleep in despair. They believed I would fade quietly into the background, far too intimidated by their accumulated wealth and social power to ever fight back. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. I did not hail a rideshare vehicle. I did not call a friend for emotional sympathy. I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed my standard applications and opened a customized, heavily encrypted server portal that I had meticulously built myself over the last 4 years. The dark screen prompted me for a highly secure multi-factor authentication sequence. I quickly typed in a complex alphanumeric passcode, followed immediately by a rapid retinal scan. A bright green light flashed on the screen, indicating successful administrative entry. The server loaded seamlessly, displaying dozens of hidden corporate registries, offshore banking trails, and classified property deeds that I had been quietly monitoring. I tapped on the master file labeled Downtown Penthouse Holdings. Preston sincerely thought he owned that luxury penthouse. Jamal thought I was just a powerless medical school dropout. Richard and Beverly thought their $50 million merger was completely untouchable. I stared intensely at the glowing code on my screen, watching the hidden financial architecture of their entire lives load perfectly into the palm of my hand. The rain continued to fall around me, but I no longer felt the cold. A slow, sharp, and incredibly dangerous smile spread across my face. "You want a war?" I whispered softly to the empty street. "You got one." I stood in the gentle rain before closing the encrypted server on my phone. The sadness was entirely gone, replaced by a cold focus. I opened my rideshare application and ordered a premium black car. While waiting, I called the property management office of my downtown residential building. I instructed the head of security to immediately revoke all secondary access privileges to my penthouse suite. I told him a hostile domestic situation was unfolding, and I required an emergency locksmith on site. The car pulled up, and I gave the driver a $50 cash tip, telling him to take the fastest route downtown. I knew exactly how Preston operated. He and Whitney would not linger at the brunch. They would head straight to the penthouse to pop champagne and physically occupy the space they believed was theirs. I had to beat them there. The ride took less than 20 minutes. I walked through the towering glass doors of the Zenith Tower, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Marcus, the head concierge, was waiting at the front desk. He handed me a fresh master keycard and informed me that the physical deadbolts on the penthouse doors were currently being swapped out. I thanked him and took a seat in the private residence lounge adjacent to the main elevators. I did not go upstairs. I wanted to be right here on the ground floor when reality finally caught up to them. The lounge was dimly lit and exceptionally quiet. I ordered an espresso and sat in a high-backed leather chair, offering a perfect view of the elevator banks. 15 minutes passed. The physical locks were changed, and the old digital keys were completely wiped from the mainframe. I sipped my dark coffee, waiting with the infinite patience of a predator. The spinning glass doors at the front entrance suddenly blurred with movement. Preston and Whitney swept into the lobby, bringing a cloud of entitlement with them. Whitney was clinging tightly to Preston's arm, giggling loudly. They bypassed the concierge desk entirely, walking with the supreme arrogance of people who believed they owned the floor beneath their feet. They stepped into the private express elevator reserved for the top 3 floors. I watched the digital indicator light up as the car ascended. 40 floors up. A minute of silence passed. I slowly placed my empty coffee cup onto the glass table. Right on schedule, the elevator descended back to the lobby level. The doors slid open, revealing Preston with a deeply irritated scowl. Whitney looked confused, tapping her designer handbag against her leg. Preston marched directly over to Marcus, slamming his silver keycard onto the marble counter. "My access card is malfunctioning," Preston snapped, his voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "Fix it immediately. I do not have time for technical incompetence." Marcus did not flinch. I apologize for the inconvenience, sir, but your access privileges to the penthouse have been permanently revoked by the primary property owner. Preston let out a harsh laugh. I am the property owner, you absolute fool. I bought that penthouse 6 months ago. Reactivate the card right now, or I will have your job. That is when I stood up from the leather chair and stepped out of the shadows. Marcus is simply following my direct orders, Preston. I said, my voice carrying clearly across the lobby. Preston spun around, his eyes narrowing as he saw me standing there. Whitney immediately hid behind his shoulder. You have got to be kidding me, Preston sneered. You beat us here just to throw a pathetic tantrum. I told you to pack your cheap clothes, Stella, not stand around harassing my employees. I reached into my purse and pulled out a certified legal packet. I walked toward the desk and dropped the documents next to his deactivated keycard. You do not own the penthouse, Preston. You never did. Preston grabbed the papers, his eyes scanning the bold print. He laughed again. This is a deed for a corporate shell company. Sterling Holdings, LLC. That is my family name. I signed the initial capital transfer myself. You are an idiot. You signed a capital transfer for a down payment? I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the precise moment the realization began to dawn on him. But you never actually read the fine print of the incorporation documents. You hate reading legal jargon. I formed that LLC. I named it Sterling Holdings to stroke your massive ego, but I registered myself as the sole managing director and 100% equity stakeholder. I funded the remaining 80% of the purchase price entirely with my own forensic accounting bonuses. The initial down payment you provided was legally classified as a non-refundable marital gift to the LLC. The penthouse belongs to the corporation, and the corporation belongs exclusively to me. You are legally a guest, and your invitation has just been permanently revoked. Preston's face turned an alarming shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged as he threw the papers back onto the desk. You manipulative liar, he shouted, taking a threatening step toward me. Whitney grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Preston, what does she mean? Where are we going to live? Preston ignored her, pulling his phone from his pocket. I am calling the police, he snarled. You cannot steal my property with a technicality. Please do, I replied. I would love to explain corporate property law to the local authorities. Preston dialed the police, his voice shaking with absolute rage as he demanded an immediate dispatch for a hostile property theft. 2 patrol officers arrived 10 minutes later. They listened to Preston's frantic yelling, and then they quietly reviewed my certified property deed and the incorporation papers. The lead officer handed the documents back to me with a respectful nod. He turned to Preston, his expression hardening. Sir, this woman is the sole legal owner of the residence. You are trespassing. You and the lady need to vacate the premises immediately, or you will be placed under arrest. Preston's mouth fell open in complete shock. The officer stepped forward, physically backing Preston and Whitney toward the spinning glass doors. They stumbled out onto the wet pavement in their ruined designer brunch clothes. Humiliated in front of the entire lobby staff, Preston slammed his hands against the glass. I will destroy your career for this, Stella, he screamed, his voice muffled by the thick doors. I will ruin you. I stood safely inside the warm, dry lobby and smiled. The war had officially begun. Monday morning arrived with a sharp chill. I walked into Vanguard Financial Partners. For 7 years, this building had been my true sanctuary. While my family operated on manipulation and emotional blackmail, Vanguard operated on absolute, indisputable numbers. I approached the security turnstiles, a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and my leather briefcase in the other. I pressed my corporate identification badge against the biometric scanner. Instead of the cheerful chime and swift parting of the glass barriers, a harsh red light flashed across the digital reader. A low, negative buzz echoed in the quiet lobby. I frowned, wiping the surface with my thumb. I tapped it against the scanner a second time. The same angry red light flared. The glass barriers remained firmly locked. Before I could signal the front desk, heavy footsteps approached from my left. I turned to see David, the head of building security, walking toward me, accompanied by Sheila from Human Resources. Their expressions were tight, professional, and radiating an overwhelming sense of clinical detachment. Stella, Sheila said, her voice dropping to a hushed, conspiratorial volume. We need you to step away from the turnstiles. Please come with us to the ground floor conference room. My analytical brain instantly mapped the variables. Human Resources waiting in the lobby before 8 in the morning. A deactivated security badge. A strict two-person security escort. This was not a glitch in the system. This was a targeted termination protocol. I followed them silently into a windowless meeting room located just behind the security desk. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in a sterile fluorescent-lit box. Sheila did not offer me a seat. She remained standing, clutching a thick manila folder against her chest, as if it were a physical shield. I am going to keep this brief, Sheila stated flatly. Effective immediately, your employment at Vanguard Financial Partners is suspended without pay. Your corporate access has been revoked, your company email is locked, and your active accounts have been reassigned to the senior partner. I stared at her, my heart dropping into my stomach. On what possible grounds? I just closed the quarterly audit for our largest tech client flawlessly. My performance reviews are impeccable. Sheila opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. We received a formal, highly documented complaint from the legal team representing your father's healthcare conglomerate. Richard officially filed a grievance claiming you engaged in corporate espionage. He alleges that you abused your accounting credentials to illegally access, download, and misappropriate confidential patient data and proprietary financial records from his clinic chain. The audacity of the lie literally stole the breath from my lungs. My father had never allowed me within 100 miles of his clinic's financial books. He kept his ledgers aggressively guarded by a team of highly paid, morally flexible accountants who specialized in hiding his aggressive tax avoidance strategies. This is a complete fabrication, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Richard is retaliating against me for a private family dispute. I have never accessed his servers. You can pull my digital footprint from the IT department right now and verify that I have not touched a single file associated with his network. We cannot do that, Stella, Sheila replied coldly. Richard escalated the complaint to the federal level. He claims you used a ghost server to bypass local security protocols. The authorities have been notified. Pending the outcome of a federal investigation, we cannot allow you to step foot on the trading floor. The firm cannot risk the liability of harboring an accused corporate spy. Vanguard has suspended you indefinitely. The brilliance of my father's strategy was terrifyingly cold. He knew he could not call my boss and demand my firing without looking petty. Instead, he leveraged his massive corporate network and his status as a healthcare CEO to trigger a federal compliance protocol. He knew an accounting firm built on client trust would panic at the mere mention of stolen data. He did not need to prove I was guilty. He only needed to cast the shadow of a doubt to destroy my career instantly. David stepped forward, handing me a medium-sized cardboard box. We have already packed the personal items from your desk, he said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. We need to escort you off the premises immediately. I looked at the cheap cardboard box. Inside sat my favorite ceramic coffee mug, a framed photograph of the city skyline, and the ergonomic mouse I had purchased myself. 7 years of dedicated work, completely erased and boxed up in 5 minutes. I held the heavy cardboard box firmly against my hip. I understand the corporate procedure, Sheila, I said quietly, but Vanguard will deeply regret taking the wrong side today. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room. David shadowed me very closely as we crossed the vast lobby. I could feel the eyes of my arriving colleagues burning into my back. They paused at the turnstiles, whispering behind their hands, watching the firm's top forensic accountant be marched out. I kept my chin perfectly level and composed. I walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped out into the bustling downtown street. The loud morning traffic roared past me. I stood on the sidewalk, the cardboard box suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. My phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I balanced the box on a planter and pulled the device out. A new text message illuminated the screen. It was Jamal. I read the words, feeling a dark calm wash over my nervous system. Told you to stay down, drop out. Sign the penthouse over to Whitney for emotional damages, and maybe Richard will drop the charges. Refuse and you can spend the next decade rotting in federal prison. I locked my screen and smiled thinly. They wanted to play games. The war had truly just begun. I shoved my phone back into my coat pocket and hailed a black car to take me straight back to the Zenith Tower. The ride was silent, providing the perfect vacuum for my mind to organize the incoming threat matrix. Jamal and Richard thought they had completely paralyzed me by freezing my corporate access at Vanguard Financial Partners. They assumed taking away my daily paycheck would force me to crawl back to them begging for mercy and signing over my multi-million-dollar penthouse just to avoid a fabricated federal indictment. They were operating on a fundamentally flawed premise. They severely underestimated my resources. They believed I was just a mid-level accountant who pushed papers and balanced trivial ledgers for middle management. They had completely missed the reality of my professional existence. I walked through the lobby of my building, giving a polite nod to Marcus at the concierge desk, and took the private elevator directly up to the 40th floor. The doors slid open to reveal my empty, immaculate sanctuary. I carried my cardboard box of desk items to the kitchen island and set it down. I did not shed a single tear over the loss of my position at Vanguard. Vanguard was simply a public-facing job, a respectable cover that provided health insurance and a regular routine. It was the job I allowed my family to see. I walked into the expansive living room, grabbed the edge of the heavy custom area rug, and dragged it back to expose the polished concrete floor beneath. I pushed the Italian leather sofas against the far walls, clearing the center of the room entirely. I needed a massive physical space to lay out the digital architecture of my impending retaliation. I went to the master bedroom closet, bypassed the rows of professional suits, and unlocked a hidden floor safe. I pulled out 3 heavy-duty military-grade encrypted laptops and a tangle of specialized networking cables. I carried the hardware back to the living room and began assembling my actual workstation. I booted up the off-grid servers. These machines were not connected to any public network or standard commercial grid. They ran on a completely dark, decentralized satellite connection that bypassed conventional internet service providers entirely. As the cooling fans whirred to life, the screens illuminated the darkened room with a sharp blue glow. I cracked my knuckles and typed in my master administrative passwords. The family thought they had successfully ruined my press week. They thought my suspension from Vanguard meant I was entirely locked out of the financial sector. They were oblivious to the fact that I held a secondary, highly classified consulting contract. I was the anonymous lead forensic auditor contracted by Zenith Horizon Equity. Zenith Horizon was the exact private equity firm currently finalizing the $50 million acquisition of Richard's regional clinic chain. My father was legally bound to hand over every single financial record, internal memo, and offshore tax filing to Zenith Horizon for final due diligence. He thought his team of expensive lawyers had properly sanitized those ledgers. He thought he was handing his documents over to a faceless team of corporate analysts in New York, who would simply rubber stamp the transaction. He had no idea that every single financial document he submitted for that $50 million buyout was being routed directly to my encrypted servers. I was the final gatekeeper for the merger. I opened the main acquisition directory and began downloading the raw data packets from Richard's clinics. I bypassed the summary reports and went straight for the granular transaction logs. I wanted to see every wire transfer, every vendor invoice, and every real estate lease agreement tied to the family business. Richard was arrogant, but he was also sloppy. He operated under the assumption that his wealth made him invisible to regulatory scrutiny. I opened a secondary window and ran a deep web indexing script specifically targeting Jamal's luxury real estate brokerage. Jamal loved to boast about his multi-million-dollar property flips on social media. He flaunted his wealth with gold watches and custom suits, claiming he was the most successful broker in the tri-state area. I knew from years of professional experience that people who bragged the loudest usually had the most to hide. I linked Jamal's public real estate transaction history with Richard's clinic lease agreements. The data streams began to cross-reference, highlighting anomalies in bright red font across my monitors. I leaned closer to the screens, my eyes tracking the rapid flow of numbers. Richard was expanding his clinic chain, aggressively buying up premium commercial real estate in high-traffic areas. However, he was not buying these properties directly. He was exclusively using Jamal's brokerage to handle the acquisitions. This setup was a blatant conflict of interest, but it was technically legal if appropriately disclosed. But the numbers I was looking at were not appropriate in any capacity. I highlighted a cluster of recent commercial property sales managed by Jamal's firm. The pattern was glaringly obvious. Jamal was acquiring prime commercial real estate on behalf of Richard's clinic chain. He would hold the properties in temporary holding companies for exactly 30 days. Then he would abruptly sell the properties right back out of the holding companies. But he was not selling them at a profit. He was liquidating premium real estate assets at a staggering 40% loss. I traced the buyer routing numbers for these heavily discounted sales. The properties were being sold to a complex web of anonymous offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Jamal was intentionally taking massive financial losses on domestic real estate to quietly funnel untraceable assets overseas. He was systematically laundering millions of dollars right under the nose of federal regulators. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the undeniable proof of massive wire fraud, and smiled. I had them exactly where I wanted them now, completely trapped in their own greed. The blue light from the monitors washed over the polished concrete floor of my penthouse. I had successfully isolated the 40% loss margins from Jamal's real estate flips, but liquidating assets at a massive deficit was only half the equation. Money laundering requires a steady source of dirty cash to pump into the clean holding companies. I needed to find out exactly where the original capital was originating before it ever hit Jamal's brokerage firm. I ran a highly specialized cross-server indexing script, perfectly matching the dates of Jamal's real estate acquisitions with the internal revenue ledgers of my father's massive healthcare conglomerate. The data visualization tool rendered a sprawling, complex web of wire transfers. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, isolating the financial tributaries flowing directly out of Richard's flagship clinics. He was not just skimming profits. The numbers were far too bloated for simple embezzlement. I pulled the specific billing codes from the clinic archives and ran them against the federal reimbursement schedules. The screen populated with thousands of individual patient records. I randomly selected 50 patient identification numbers and cross-referenced them against public death registries and federal tax databases. The results hit my screen like a physical blow. 38 of the 50 patients were deceased. The remaining 12 had never visited a clinic in their entire lives. Richard and Beverly were billing the federal government for highly specialized, incredibly expensive medical procedures that absolutely never happened. They were injecting phantom capital into the clinic ledgers, transferring the dirty federal money to Jamal's real estate firm under the guise of corporate expansion budgets, and then Jamal was taking deliberate losses to wash the funds into offshore accounts. It was a textbook multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud syndicate. But criminal syndicates of this magnitude always required a designated fall guy. Richard was ruthless, but he was inherently cautious. He would never expose himself to a federal indictment without an ironclad insurance policy. I initiated a forced decryption protocol on the Cayman Island routing numbers. It took the server exactly 12 minutes to break the complex encryption hash. I watched the progress bar inch toward 100%, my pulse thrumming heavily in my ears. The secure banking manifest finally unrolled across my primary monitor. I clicked on the primary beneficiary registry for the offshore accounts. I expected to see a shadow corporation. I expected to see Richard's name buried deep under a dozen proxy signatures. Instead, I saw my own face. A high-resolution scan of my passport stared back at me from the glowing screen. Below it was a perfectly forged signature matching my handwriting flawlessly. I sat completely frozen in my ergonomic chair. My parents had not just funneled millions in stolen federal funds into the Cayman accounts, they had legally structured the entire criminal enterprise to list me as the sole primary beneficiary and managing director of the offshore holding companies. I was the architect of the fraud on paper. Every single illegal dollar was tied directly to my personal identification. My analytical mind raced backward through every interaction I had ever had with my parents. I thought about the time my mother insisted on handling my passport renewal 5 years ago, claiming she was doing me a favor because I was too busy with work. I thought about my father demanding certified copies of my professional accounting licenses, telling me he wanted to keep them in his office files because he was supposedly proud of my accomplishments. I thought about Preston taking my phone and laptop for software updates. They had quietly gathered everything they needed to build a perfect corporate decoy. When Richard filed that fabricated complaint with my accounting firm this morning claiming I was a corporate spy, he was not just trying to get me fired to teach me a lesson. He was deliberately laying the groundwork for a federal investigation. He was handing the Federal Bureau of Investigation a neatly packaged narrative. The disgruntled, unstable daughter, armed with elite forensic accounting skills, went completely rogue and embezzled millions from her own family business. He suspended me to make me look guilty. The cold, horrific truth settled deep into my bones, replacing the last remaining shred of familial loyalty with absolute ice. They never hated my career choice. They never actually viewed my spreadsheets and my financial audits as a disappointment. They had actively encouraged my isolation. They wanted me to be the quiet, invisible accountant who never asked questions and never demanded the spotlight. They did not just tolerate me. They bred me to be their perfect scapegoat. If the feds ever came knocking, Preston gets his $50 million trust fund, Whitney gets her luxury life and her perfect new family, Richard and Beverly keep their massive healthcare empire, and Stella takes the fall and rots in a federal penitentiary. They had planned to sacrifice me to save themselves. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the cool surface of the monitor, covering the forged signature that was meant to end my life. I was supposed to panic. I was supposed to run to them begging for protection from the federal government, completely surrendering my penthouse and my dignity just to stay out of prison. That was their fatal miscalculation. They built a trap for a victim. They did not realize they had handed the keys to the kingdom to a predator. I opened a new terminal window and began executing a completely different set of commands. I was not going to hide. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire operation from the inside out. I highlighted the Cayman routing numbers and initiated an anonymous data dump sequence directly to the primary server of Zenith Horizon Equity. The war had escalated. The data transfer to Zenith Horizon Equity completed with a silent, glowing confirmation on my screen. The trap was set on the corporate front, but I knew my family well enough to anticipate their immediate tactical response. Richard and Beverly were meticulous architects of their own survival. Suspending me from Vanguard Financial Partners and initiating a federal inquiry was only the opening salvo. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation to secure a watertight indictment against me, the authorities would need physical, irrefutable evidence located on my personal hardware. My parents needed to plant the forged Cayman Island documents and the fabricated patient records directly onto my local network. They needed a smoking gun, and I was going to hand them a loaded weapon. I disconnected my encrypted servers, packed them into a Faraday bag, and stashed them back inside the hidden floor safe. I then retrieved my old commercially purchased laptop, the one my family believed I used for my daily accounting tasks. I placed it prominently on the kitchen island, plugged it securely into the wall, and left the screen illuminated. I opened a standard, unencrypted email client. With deliberate keystrokes, I drafted a frantic message to a luxury private aviation charter company based in Miami. I inquired about the immediate availability of a single cash-funded flight to a jurisdiction with absolutely no extradition treaties with the United States. I explicitly mentioned that I was fully willing to pay triple the standard rate for discretion and immediate departure. I hit send, routing the email through the unsecured building wireless network that I knew Jamal had previously compromised. The bait was incredibly rich, specifically tailored to trigger their worst fears. A scapegoat fleeing the country ruins the entire sacrificial strategy. If I disappeared, the federal investigators would immediately pivot their focus back to Richard and Jamal. I grabbed a large canvas duffel bag, hastily stuffed it with a random assortment of clothes, and walked out of the penthouse. I rode the elevator down to the basement parking garage, bypassed my usual parking spot, and slipped out the side delivery exit. Less than an hour later, I was sitting in the back of a rented, unmarked utility van, parked discreetly on the opposite side of the street from the Zenith Tower. The cargo hold of the van was entirely dark, save for the bright glow of 3 high-definition monitors I had mounted to the interior paneling. When I first purchased the penthouse, I had secretly installed a network of microscopic motion-activated digital surveillance cameras, embedded in the crown molding the smoke detectors and the recessed lighting fixtures. I pulled a thick wool blanket over my shoulders, booted up the remote viewing software, and sipped lukewarm black coffee from a paper cup. I stared at the monitors, waiting with the cold, measured patience of a sniper. The sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long shadows across the pavement. 2 hours passed in total silence. Just as the streetlights flickered to life, the feed from my private elevator lobby blipped. The motion sensor engaged. I leaned closer to the monitor. The heavy polished doors of the express elevator slid open. Preston stepped out onto the 40th floor. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, and thick leather gloves. He looked ridiculous, like a wealthy suburbanite playing the role of a desperate burglar. I watched in high definition as he approached the front door of my penthouse. Since I had changed the physical deadbolts and wiped the digital mainframe that morning, Preston could no longer rely on his deactivated keycard. Instead, he pulled a heavy titanium crowbar from his jacket and wedged it against the reinforced doorframe. He clearly had no idea how to properly breach a high-security door, sweating and straining against the metal. After 5 minutes of brute force, the door jamb splintered and the lock finally gave way with a loud snap. Preston slipped inside, breathing heavily. The night vision lenses on my cameras automatically adjusted, tracking his every movement in crisp, unassailable digital resolution. He bypassed the living room entirely and moved straight toward the kitchen island, drawn immediately to the glowing screen of the decoy laptop. He pulled a silver USB flash drive from his pocket. I recognized the drive instantly. It was the exact model Richard mandated for all senior executives at the clinic chain, equipped with an auto-run protocol designed to silently dump files into the background partitions of a hard drive. Preston jammed the USB into the side of my laptop. I watched the progress bar on my remote monitor as gigabytes of fabricated evidence flooded into the local storage. He was planting the forged offshore banking manifests, the phantom Medicare billing codes, and a series of fake internal memos, carefully authored to make me look like a criminal mastermind. He stood there for exactly 4 minutes, shifting his weight nervously from side to side, checking his watch. When the transfer hit 100%, he yanked the drive out, shoved it back into his pocket, and practically ran back out the door, leaving the splintered wood hanging off the hinges. I sat in the cold, dark surveillance van, watching the empty penthouse on the monitors. I had him. I had crystal clear, irrefutable video and audio evidence of Preston committing a felony break and trespassing and planting fabricated digital evidence. I reached for my cell phone, my thumb hovering directly over the emergency keypad. I could call the police right now. I could have a patrol unit intercept Preston before he even reached his car. He would be arrested, charged with breaking and entering, and likely panic during the interrogation. But I slowly lowered the phone. Arresting Preston tonight would be a massive tactical error. Preston was arrogant and foolish, but he was ultimately just an errand boy. He was a pawn executing orders blindly. If I sent him to jail right now, Richard Beverly and Jamal would instantly realize the trap had been sprung. They would immediately destroy the offshore accounts, shred the remaining clinic ledgers, and vanish behind an army of corporate defense attorneys. They would sacrifice Preston to save the syndicate. I needed the network to burn simultaneously. I needed the feds to have nowhere to look. I reached forward and saved the video files to 3 encrypted cloud drives. I smiled in the darkness. Preston handed me the leverage I needed to rip the empire to shreds. I did not need police tonight. I needed the big fish. I disconnected my secondary hard drive, securing the 4K footage of Preston's felony break-in into a protective case inside the surveillance van. The trap had functioned flawlessly, but he was merely bait. I needed the apex predator. I walked to a convenience store, purchased a prepaid phone with cash, and activated it. At exactly 6, I sent a carefully calibrated message to Jamal's private number reserved for illicit back-channel negotiations. The text was desperate, engineered to stroke his ego. I claimed Vanguard froze me out and federal authorities were closing in. I begged for a discreet meeting, promising to surrender my assets for legal protection. I chose a very obscure coffee shop in the financial district. It was a gritty cash-only establishment devoid of security cameras. It was the perfect place for Jamal to corner a desperate victim. I arrived early, selecting a shadowed corner booth with my back flush against the brick wall, giving me an unobstructed view of the entrance. I ordered black coffee and waited, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. Jamal walked through the battered door right on schedule. He was a walking caricature of unearned wealth, wearing a bespoke suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch. He surveyed the dingy cafe with open disgust, his lip curling as he navigated the sticky linoleum floor. He spotted me in the corner, and his arrogant smirk instantly returned. He slid into the vinyl booth opposite me, not bothering to remove his expensive cashmere overcoat. "You look absolutely pathetic, Stella." Jamal started leaning back and crossing his arms over his broad chest. "I told Richard you would crack under the pressure. You always were the weakest link in this family. Vanguard kicked you to the curb, and now the federal government is breathing down your neck. You have nowhere left to run." He reached inside his tailored jacket and extracted a thick legal document, tossing it carelessly onto the scratched wooden table. It was a comprehensive ironclad non-disclosure agreement paired with a complete transfer of property deed. "This is your only lifeline," Jamal stated, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "You sign that document right now. You legally hand over the Zenith Tower penthouse to Whitney today. In exchange, Richard will leverage his legal team to help you navigate this unfortunate IRS glitch. We will tell the feds you made a few rogue accounting errors due to extreme mental stress. You will take the fall for the financial discrepancies, do a few months in a minimum security facility, and we will make sure you have a small stipend when you get out. You owe this family, Stella. It is time to pay your debts." I did not flinch. I did not move my hands. I simply stared at the legal documents, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated sociopathy required to classify a multi-million-dollar orchestrated Medicare fraud syndicate as an unfortunate IRS glitch. They truly believed I was stupid enough to sign away my freedom to protect their criminal empire. "You are remarkably quiet," Jamal sneered, leaning forward to tap his manicured finger against the signature line. "Did you lose your voice along with your precious career?" "Sign the paper, Stella. I have a 9 o'clock tea time and I despise the smell of this establishment." I slowly reached into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the pen he offered and instead pulled out a sleek, high-definition tablet. I powered on the screen and slid it smoothly across the table until it rested directly on top of his ridiculous non-disclosure agreement. I watched his eyes track the movement, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. "I am not going to sign your documents, Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly calm, echoing with a chilling, hollow resonance. "But you are going to look very closely at mine." Jamal glanced down at the illuminated screen. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an unnatural, chalky gray. Displayed in bright, undeniable clarity were the highly encrypted routing numbers from his Cayman Island offshore accounts. I had mapped the exact granular trajectory of the stolen federal funds. The screen showed the phantom Medicare billing codes flowing out of Richard's clinics, transferring into Jamal's luxury real estate holding companies, and washing directly into the overseas accounts. Every single illicit transaction, every massive 40% property loss, every fraudulent wire transfer was documented with absolute forensic perfection. "Where did you get this?" Jamal stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked, breathless whisper. His hands began to tremble violently as he stared at the financial ruin of his entire life. This is highly classified banking data. You hacked a federal system. You are going to prison. I am the lead forensic auditor for Zenith Horizon Equity, I replied coldly. I did not hack anything. Richard legally handed me every piece of this data. Before Jamal could process the catastrophic weight of that revelation, I tapped an audio file on the screen. I had extracted the recording directly from Preston's cellular device when he foolishly plugged his infected USB drive into my decoy laptop the previous night. Preston's malware had worked both ways, allowing my server to mirror his phone data instantly. The audio file began playing clearly through the crisp stereo speakers. It was a recorded phone call between Jamal and Richard. The federal heat is increasing. Richard Jamal's recorded voice echoed in the quiet coffee shop. We need to trigger the scapegoat protocol immediately. Plant the offshore routing data on Stella's local network. Once the feds find the money linked to her personal passport credentials, they will lock her up and stop digging. She is completely disposable. I paused the audio playback and slowly looked up. Jamal sat completely paralyzed, his watch catching the dim overhead light as he realized the trap had firmly snapped shut. The recording continued to play, identifying the location as the Zenith Country Club locker room. My father's voice was low, harsh, and dripping with venomous calculation. Preston's nervous cadence chimed in, asking about the secondary timeline if the federal auditors bypassed my decoy laptop. Richard did not hesitate. His response sliced through the quiet hum of the coffee shop with surgical precision. As soon as the $50 million benchmark clears the Cayman proxy accounts, we throw Jamal to the feds, Richard stated. It is a flawless pivot. The Internal Revenue Service loves a flashy, arrogant black real estate broker to parade on the evening news. He fits their narrative perfectly. He buys the cars he wears, the watches he flaunts, the wealth. They will tear his life apart trying to find the bottom of the embezzlement well. By the time he figures out what hit him, he will be sitting in a federal holding cell. Preston stammered, asking about Whitney and the new baby. Richard laughed. It was a cold, metallic sound that I had only heard a few times, always right before he finalized a hostile corporate takeover. Whitney will divorce him the second the indictment drops, Richard replied effortlessly. We already have the separation papers drafted. She claims zero knowledge of his illicit financial activities, takes full custody of the baby, and we keep the money safely insulated in the offshore trusts. Jamal takes the entire fall. We sacrifice the son-in-law, we preserve the bloodline. It is collateral damage. I tapped the screen, cutting the audio feed and plunging our corner booth back into silence. I watched Jamal process the magnitude of the betrayal. The physical transformation was absolute. The arrogant corporate shark dissolved right in front of my eyes. His broad shoulders slumped, the impeccable posture collapsing under the weight of Richard's spoken words. The blood had left his face, making his skin look ashen and drawn. His expensive silk tie suddenly seemed like a noose tightening around his throat. He was not a partner. He was an expendable asset, a carefully curated backup scapegoat held in reserve just in case I managed to slip the trap. Richard had deliberately recruited him, encouraged his flashy lifestyle, and weaponized his racial identity, all to paint an irresistible target on his back for the federal government. Whitney, his adoring wife, was fully complicit, ready to discard him and take his child the moment the authorities knocked on their custom mahogany front door. Jamal stared at his hands trembling uncontrollably on the wooden table. The non-disclosure agreement he had slid across the table minutes ago now looked like a joke, a meaningless piece of paper in the face of absolute systemic ruin. He swallowed hard. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked up at me, and for the first time in the 5 years I had known him, the condescension was entirely gone. It was replaced by a raw, naked terror. They set me up, Jamal whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. From the very beginning, the initial capital injections for the real estate flips, the encouragement to buy the yachts. Richard told me I needed to project absolute success to attract investors. He was building my profile for a federal indictment. He was dressing me up for the slaughter. You are a distraction, I replied, my voice devoid of sympathy. You are the shiny object meant to draw attention away from the core healthcare syndicate. We are in the exact same position, Jamal. They bred me to take the fall for the corporate accounting fraud, and they bought you to take the fall for the money laundering. If my decoy fails, you go to prison. If your decoy fails, I go to prison. Richard and Beverly walk away with $50 million, and Whitney raises your child on stolen money. Jamal closed his eyes, a shudder running through his massive frame. When he opened them again, the terror had receded, replaced by a cold, radiating fury. The arrogant broker was dead. In his place was a cornered predator, realizing exactly who had pushed him into the cage. He slowly reached across the table and placed his hand flat over his own non-disclosure agreement. With a deliberate motion, he crumpled the legal document into a tight ball and tossed it onto the floor. I am not going to a federal penitentiary so Richard can protect his healthcare empire, Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a lethal cadence. And I am absolutely not letting Whitney take my child and walk away with my life. Then you are going to help me dismantle them, I stated, leaning forward and meeting his furious gaze. I have the offshore routing data, and I have the evidence of Preston's break-in, but Richard is paranoid. The primary federal billing ledgers, the actual patient records that prove the Medicare fraud originates at the clinic level, those are not stored on the main network. I audited the entire system. The data is phantom. He is keeping the primary servers isolated, totally air-gapped from the corporate mainframe. I need access to that raw data. I need the foundational architecture of the fraud. Jamal did not hesitate. His loyalty to the family had evaporated the moment Richard's voice echoed from my tablet. He reached deep into the breast pocket of his cashmere overcoat. He bypassed his expensive wallet and pulled out a small matte black flash drive. It lacked any corporate branding, an unassuming piece of hardware. He held it tightly in his palm for a fraction of a second, feeling the weight of the decision, before sliding it smoothly across the scratched wooden table. It stopped inches from my coffee cup. Richard does not keep the primary servers air-gapped because he is paranoid about hackers, Jamal said, his eyes locking onto mine with venomous intent. He keeps them air-gapped because he does not trust Preston to manage the encryption. Richard made me the secondary administrator for the physical server farm located in the basement of the flagship clinic. That drive contains the master passwords, the biometric bypass codes, and the static IP addresses for every hidden terminal in the building. I picked up the flash drive, the cold metal heavy with the promise of absolute destruction. This tiny device was the singular key required to permanently dismantle Richard's empire and ensure that we both survived the impending fallout. Burn them to the ground, Jamal whispered. The flash drive Jamal left on the scratched wooden table felt heavier than a gold ingot. I did not return to the penthouse. Instead, I rented a windowless motel room on the outskirts of the city, a place that dealt exclusively in cash and asked zero questions. I booted up my secure terminal and plugged in the drive. Jamal had not lied. The encryption keys bypassed Richard's multi-million-dollar firewall like a hot knife through butter. I gained direct, unrestricted access to the air-gapped servers buried in the basement of the flagship clinic. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. I downloaded the raw, unedited patient ledgers, cross-referencing the fabricated procedures with the internal emails between Richard and Beverly. They were explicitly discussing which deceased patients to bill next. I bundled the entire data package, combining it with Preston's recorded confession and the offshore routing numbers. The weapon was fully assembled. I just needed the perfect stage to deploy it. 72 hours later, the Zenith Healthcare Empire hosted the social event of the season. Whitney was throwing her baby shower at the Grand Continental Hotel, renting out the entire Diamond Ballroom. It was not just a celebration of pending motherhood, it was a highly orchestrated public relations maneuver designed to officially debut Preston as her new partner. Jamal had been quietly erased from the family narrative, cast aside precisely as Richard had planned. The local media and elite socialites were all in attendance, sipping imported champagne and marveling at the towering ice sculptures. They were there to witness the seamless continuation of the family dynasty. I stepped out of my cab and handed the valet a crisp $100 bill. For 30 years I had dressed to disappear. I wore muted grays and sensible navy suits, purposely blending into the background the invisible, obedient accountant. Tonight I wore a stunning floor-length crimson dress. It was a bold, unapologetic declaration of open war. The heavy silk swept across the marble floor of the hotel lobby as I bypassed the check-in desk and moved directly toward the diamond ballroom. The heavy oak doors were flanked by private security, but my last name still held weight. I looked the head guard dead in the eye, and he stepped aside without a single word of protest. I pushed the double doors open. The sheer opulence of the room hit me like a physical wave. Thousands of white roses hung from the crystal chandeliers, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Whitney stood on a raised dais at the far end of the room, her maternity dress sparkling under the camera flashes. Preston stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, playing the role of the devoted future father perfectly. Richard and Beverly were working the crowd, clinking glasses with hospital administrators and local politicians. I walked straight down the center aisle. The vibrant crimson fabric of my dress cut through the sea of pastel cocktail attire like a siren. The low murmur of conversation gradually died out, replaced by a tense, rippling silence. Heads turned, glasses were slowly lowered. The string quartet faltered on a note and trailed off into absolute quiet. Whitney spotted me first. Her manufactured smile froze, her eyes widening in genuine panic. She grabbed Preston's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Preston stared at me, his jaw clenching as he recognized the woman he had tried to frame just days prior. Before I could reach the dais, Beverly broke away from her group of wealthy socialites. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She marched toward me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She did not bother to lower her voice or maintain her usual facade of elegant restraint. She closed the distance between us, raised her hand, and delivered a vicious, stinging slap across my left cheek. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Several guests gasped in shock. I felt the hot, sudden sting of her heavy diamond ring scraping against my skin, but I did not stumble backward. I did not raise my trembling hand to touch my face. I stood perfectly still, my posture completely rigid, absorbing the violent blow without breaking eye contact. "Security!" Beverly screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Remove this psychotic stalker immediately. You have no right to be here. You are completely unstable." Two large men in dark suits began pushing their way through the crowd of stunned guests, moving rapidly toward the center aisle. Richard was fast approaching directly behind his wife, his face flushed purple with unbridled rage, signaling frantically for the guards to hurry. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to burst into tears to beg for forgiveness, or to run away in absolute shame, just like the obedient scapegoat they had raised me to be. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head, locking my gaze onto the DJ stand positioned just a few short feet to my right. The young sound technician was standing frozen behind his mixing board, staring wide-eyed at the unfolding family drama. I took 2 swift steps, reached over the thick velvet rope cordoning off his expensive equipment, and grabbed the silver wireless microphone resting on the edge of the console. I flicked the power switch with my thumb. The massive sound system speakers emitted a sharp, brief burst of static, freezing the approaching security guards in their tracks and drawing every single eye in the elegant, brightly lit ballroom directly to me. I looked right past Beverly's furious glare. I looked past Richard's panicked signaling. I locked my eyes directly onto Whitney and Preston, who were standing rigidly on the raised platform. "I brought a gift for the happy couple," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the massive silent room. I tightened my grip on the microphone. The sheer weight of the silence in the diamond ballroom was intoxicating. Beverly's handprint still burned on my left cheek, a pulsing reminder of every blow this family dealt me. But the pain only sharpened my focus. I turned slightly, locking eyes with the young sound technician, cowering behind his mixing board. Earlier this afternoon, I slipped him $500 and a heavily encrypted flash drive, instructing him to bypass the hotel's standard visual presentation loop the moment I gave the signal. I gave him a sharp nod. He swallowed hard, trembling as he hit the master override switch. The ambient lighting abruptly cut to pitch black. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite socialites and hospital administrators. Behind the raised dais, the massive floor-to-ceiling projector screen hummed to life, bathing Whitney and Preston in a stark, unforgiving white glare. The first slide was not a sonogram or a curated maternity photo shoot. It was a certified financial ledger, completely unredacted, stamped with the insignia of an offshore lending syndicate. I raised the microphone. My voice boomed across the cavernous space, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and silencing the panicked whispers that had immediately begun to spread across the opulent room. You see, Richard and Beverly have worked tirelessly to curate the perfect family image. They want you to believe Preston is the ideal partner, a wealthy, successful entrepreneur ready to step into the Zenith healthcare dynasty. But Preston is not an entrepreneur. He is a parasite. I clicked a remote hidden in my palm, advancing the slide. The screen magnified a specific cell on the ledger, highlighting a staggering negative balance. Preston is currently $3 million in debt to a network of underground creditors. He does not have a trust fund. He does not have a portfolio. He has a ticking clock, and his loan sharks are demanding immediate payment. He clung to Whitney for one very specific reason. He desperately needed direct access to Richard's incoming $50 million corporate merger to save his own pathetic life. A low, horrified murmur swept through the ballroom. Guests began whispering fiercely, pointing at the glowing screen. Whitney stood absolutely frozen on the dais, her trembling hands hovering protectively over her pregnant stomach. She looked at Preston, her wide eyes begging him to deny the numbers glaring behind them. Preston's face was completely drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The illusion of the perfect future son-in-law was shattering in real time before everyone. But financial ruin is just the appetizer. I continued, my voice easily slicing through the rising panic. Richard always taught us to thoroughly vet our investments. It is a pity he did not audit his own daughter's bedroom. I clicked the remote a final time. The financial ledger vanished, replaced immediately by highly classified sealed medical records originating directly from Dr. Thorne's private clinic. I found them buried within the air-gapped servers Jamal handed over. The screen illuminated a stark diagnosis complete with Preston's full legal name, date of birth, and patient identification number. Preston is not just bankrupt, he is a walking biological hazard. These are his active medical charts. They detail a chronic, highly contagious, sexually transmitted infection, a condition he has actively hidden from Whitney throughout their entire relationship, exposing her and her unborn child to catastrophic health complications. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Whitney let out a piercing, agonizing scream. It was a sound of absolute betrayal that cut straight to the bone. She stumbled backward, physically recoiling from Preston as if he were covered in acid. She tripped backwards over the edge of the floral arrangement, collapsing heavily into Beverly's arms. The crowd erupted into total chaos. The carefully maintained high society decorum vanished in a single terrifying second. Guests shoved each other toward the exits, desperate to escape the blast radius of the scandal. Reporters in the back of the room frantically snapped photos of the glowing medical records, their camera flashes blinding in the dim light. Preston snapped. The carefully curated mask of the charming partner dissolved into raw, animalistic rage. "I am going to kill you!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He lunged off the raised dais, launching his body directly at me. He closed the distance in 3 strides, hands outstretched, aiming for my throat. I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground, my posture relaxed, the microphone still resting comfortably in my hand. He never made it. 2 massive hotel security guards, the same men Beverly had summoned to remove me, intercepted him mid-air. They tackled Preston to the polished hardwood floor with a bone-jarring thud. One guard drove a heavy knee squarely into Preston's spine, pinning him to the ground, while the other violently twisted his arms painfully behind his back. Preston thrashed and screamed, face pressed against the marble, completely immobilized. The ballroom was a theater of absolute destruction. Whitney was sobbing hysterically on the floor, surrounded by trampled white roses. The elite guests were scrambling for the lobby. The illusion of the Zenith healthcare dynasty was reduced to ashes in less than 5 minutes. But Richard did not join the panic. He did not rush to comfort his sobbing daughter, or even bother to check on his disgraced future son-in-law. He stepped over the scattered floral arrangements, bypassing the chaos entirely. He stopped just inches away. His dark eyes were cold dead, and entirely empty of anything resembling human emotion. He looked at the screaming crowd, then back to me, straightening his bespoke tie with a terrifying calm. "You think a little public embarrassment stops me?" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "Tomorrow at exactly 9 in the morning, I sign the paperwork for a $50 million merger. You are dead in this town." The digital clock on my dashboard glared bright red in the darkness, reading exactly 2 in the morning. The adrenaline from the ballroom confrontation had slowly bled out of my system, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Richard's parting threat echoed in the quiet cab of my car. He genuinely believed his wealth and influence could outpace the devastation I had just unleashed. He thought the massive $50 million merger at 9 o'clock would save him. He was wrong. I had the master files secured in my leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat. Jamal's flash drive contained enough raw, undeniable evidence to bury Richard Beverly and their entire healthcare syndicate before the ink on their merger documents could even dry. I turned the steering wheel, guiding my vehicle down the steep concrete ramp into the subterranean parking garage of my penthouse building. The garage was a sprawling subterranean cavern of fluorescent lights and gray concrete, utterly silent at this hour. I navigated toward my reserved spot near the private elevator bank, the tires squeaking softly against the polished floor. I threw the car into park, killed the engine, and grabbed my briefcase. The heavy silence of the underground structure pressed in on me as I stepped out into the chilly air. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, a steady beat, marking the final hours of the empire my family had built on lies and stolen federal funds. I was 50 feet away from the reinforced glass doors of the security vestibule when a shadow detached itself from the thick concrete pillar to my left. I stopped dead in my tracks. Preston stepped into the harsh overhead light, and the sight of him sent a spike of pure ice straight down my spine. He was a ruined man. The bespoke suit he had worn at the baby shower was torn and covered in dirt, the tie missing his dress shirt unbuttoned and stained with sweat. His face was bruised, likely from his violent encounter with the hotel security team, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. He was breathing heavily, a desperate rattling sound that echoed in the empty garage. But it was the object clutched tightly in his right hand that made my blood run cold. It was a heavy, solid steel tire iron. He had been dumped by Whitney, publicly humiliated, and stripped of the Zenith healthcare protection he had been counting on. His loan sharks were likely already hunting him down, demanding the $3 million he no longer had any way of securing. I had systematically severed his only lifeline, and he had nothing left to lose. He knew I had the master files. "Give me the drive, Stella," Preston rasped, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, ragged desperation. He took a slow, unsteady step toward me, raising the heavy steel bar. "You took everything." Whitney blocked my number. Richard's private security threw me out of the hotel through the service entrance. "The creditors are waiting at my apartment. They are going to kill me. I need those files to bargain with Richard. I will give him the master records, and he will pay off the debt. Hand over the briefcase." "Richard is not going to save you, Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level while my eyes quickly scanned the empty garage for an avenue of escape. "He explicitly told Jamal you were an expendable asset. You are a biological hazard to his daughter and a financial liability to his company. You are already dead to him." My words hit him like a physical strike. His face contorted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. He let out a guttural scream and lunged across the concrete floor, bringing the heavy tire iron swinging down in a brutal, sweeping arc aimed directly at my head. I threw my body sideways, diving hard onto the cold pavement. The solid steel bar whistled through the air where my skull had been a fraction of a second prior, smashing violently into the side mirror of a parked luxury sedan. The shattering glass exploded outward, raining sharp shards across the garage floor. I scrambled backward, my crimson dress tearing against the rough concrete, adrenaline flooding my veins in a massive, blinding rush. Preston recovered instantly, pivoting on his heel and stepping toward me with terrifying speed. He swung the iron bar again, aiming for my ribs. I swung my heavy leather briefcase upward with both hands, using it as a makeshift shield. The tire iron slammed into the thick leather with a bone-jarring thud. The impact sent a shock wave of agonizing pain shooting up both of my arms, but the briefcase absorbed the lethal force of the blow. The collision knocked me backward, my shoulders hitting a concrete pillar. He raised the weapon for a third strike, his eyes entirely devoid of reason. I kicked out with everything I had, driving the pointed heel of my stiletto directly into his kneecap. Preston roared in agony, his leg buckling under his weight. He stumbled the tire iron, dropping slightly as he fought to maintain his balance. It was the only opening I was going to get. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning the ruined briefcase on the floor, and bolted toward the private elevator bank. I sprinted across the concrete, the sound of Preston's heavy, uneven footsteps pounding right behind me. The entrance was protected by a reinforced security vestibule, an enclosed chamber with dual glass doors. I swiped my biometric fob, and the outer doors opened. I darted inside the transparent box. Preston lunged in right after me, raising his weapon. I immediately slipped through the inner door, pulling it shut before he could cross the threshold. I slammed the manual override button on the lobby wall. The outer doors locked instantly. Preston was now completely trapped inside the building's reinforced security vestibule, screaming and wildly smashing his heavy tire iron against bulletproof glass. I watched through the thick bulletproof glass as Preston descended into absolute madness. He swung the heavy steel tire iron again and again, the metal clashing violently against the reinforced transparent barrier separating us. Each strike sent spiderweb fractures through the outer layers of the safety glass, but the core held firm, easily absorbing his frantic, uncoordinated blows. His face was contorted into a grotesque mask of raw panic and rage, sweat pouring down his forehead, staining his ruined designer collar. He was screaming obscenities, his voice muffled and distorted by the heavy acoustic seal of the security vestibule. I stood perfectly still on the pristine lobby marble, my breathing steady, watching the apex predator of the Zenith Healthcare Syndicate reduce himself to a caged, rabid animal. I did not need to reach for my cellular device. Building security had automatically triggered the silent alarm the moment the outer doors were breached with a weapon. Less than 3 minutes later, the distinct piercing wail of police sirens echoed down the concrete ramp of the subterranean garage. Blue and red emergency lights painted the gray walls in frantic, strobing colors as 3 heavily armored police cruisers screeched to a halt, their tires smoking against the pavement. 6 officers spilled out instantly, their service weapons drawn and leveled directly at the glass enclosure. They shouted commands, their voices echoing sharply in the cavernous underground structure, ordering Preston to drop the weapon and place his hands flat against the glass. For a fraction of a second, Preston hesitated, his chest heaving, his bloodshot eyes darting from the aimed barrels of the police-issued firearms back to me. He realized the absolute finality of his situation. The heavy steel tire iron slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the vestibule floor. He slowly sank to his knees, pressing his palms against the glass in a gesture of total surrender. The lead detective, a seasoned, sharp-eyed man with a graying mustache, signaled his team to breach the outer doors. They moved with absolute precision, throwing Preston flat onto his stomach, kicking his legs apart and forcefully wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the garage. I smoothly pressed the manual override button on the inner wall, releasing the electronic seal, and stepped confidently out of the lobby and into the chaotic crime scene. The lead detective turned to me, his notebook already out, preparing to take a standard victim statement regarding a domestic dispute or a random mugging. I did not give him a tearful narrative. I gave him a fully compiled, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I reached into the hidden pocket of my torn crimson dress and extracted a sleek, high-definition memory drive. I held it out to the detective. "There is no need for a lengthy preliminary investigation, detective," I stated, my voice echoing with icy authority. "That drive contains multiple camera angles of the unprovoked, premeditated attack that just occurred in this garage. You will find crystal clear footage of that man attempting to strike me with a deadly weapon. However, that is merely the secondary charge." The detective paused, his pen hovering over the notebook, his eyes narrowing as he took the drive. "If you open the primary folder marked Zenith," I continued, ensuring my voice carried over to where Preston was currently being hauled to his feet by two officers, "you will find comprehensive high-definition surveillance footage from 36 hours ago. It details this exact individual executing a highly coordinated felony break-in at my private residence. The audio files capture his entire motive, including his explicit intent to plant fabricated federal routing data on my personal servers to frame me for a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme." Preston thrashed violently against the officers holding him, his face draining of whatever color remained. The realization of what I had just handed the authorities hit him like a freight train. He was not just going down for a botched assault. I had just handed the police the foundational evidence required to trigger a massive federal racketeering investigation. The detective read Preston his Miranda rights, his voice a steady rhythmic drone that sealed Preston's fate. The charges were listed with brutal clarity: attempted aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, felony breaking and entering, destruction of private property, wire fraud conspiracy. They dragged Preston toward the back of the nearest cruiser. He fought them every step of the way, begging, pleading, demanding to make his legally mandated phone call before they transported him to the central holding facility. The detective, wanting to keep the situation contained, nodded to one of the officers. The officer extracted Preston's sleek smartphone from his ruined suit jacket, dialed the requested number, and held the device to Preston's ear, keeping a firm grip on the suspect's shoulder. It was exactly 2 a.m. I knew exactly who Preston was calling. He was using his one lifeline to reach the only man who possessed the financial capital to pull him out of this catastrophic freefall. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice sharp, alert, and irritated by the late hour. "Richard, you have to help me!" Preston screamed into the phone, tears of absolute terror streaming down his bruised face. "Stella set a trap. She has everything. She gave the police the garage footage, and she gave them the surveillance files from the penthouse break-in. They are charging me with multiple felonies. I am in handcuffs. My loan sharks are waiting at my apartment, and the police are taking me to central booking. I need you to wire the bail money right now. I need your corporate legal team down here immediately." I stepped closer, close enough to hear the tinny metallic resonance of Richard's voice leaking from the phone speaker. Richard did not express concern. He did not ask for details. His mind was a steel trap, instantly calculating the collateral damage, weighing the value of his future son-in-law against the impending $50 million Zenith healthcare merger, scheduled to be signed in exactly 7 hours. Preston was no longer an asset. Preston was a highly toxic, radioactive liability that threatened to derail the crowning achievement of Richard's entire corporate existence. Richard's response was devoid of any human warmth, a chilling, calculated execution delivered over a cellular signal. "I do not know you," Richard stated, his voice completely dead, severing the connection, and abandoning his golden boy to protect the morning's PR image. I left the flashing red and blue lights of the police precinct behind, sliding into the quiet back seat of an unmarked black SUV. The digital clock on the dashboard read exactly 4 a.m. The city streets were deserted, washed in the pale glow of the overhead street lamps. My destination was not a hotel or a safe house. It was a windowless concrete building located deep within the financial district. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, passing through metal detectors, and surrendering my phone to the armed guards. 2 agents were waiting for me in the sterile lobby. Special Agent Miller from the FBI was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp, evaluating eyes and a permanently creased forehead. Standing next to him was Agent Vance from the IRS. Vance carried a thick binder and possessed the meticulous, exhausted energy of an auditor who had been chasing ghosts for years. They escorted me into a secure, soundproof conference room located deep within the subterranean levels of the building. The room contained nothing but a steel table, 3 chairs, and a highly secure terminal. I sat down and unclasped my leather briefcase. I extracted my laptop and the matte black flash drive Jamal had surrendered. Miller and Vance pulled up chairs on either side of me, their expressions tense and expectant. For months, Zenith Healthcare had been a phantom target. Richard possessed the capital and the political connections to keep the federal authorities completely locked out of his internal systems. He had insulated himself perfectly, utilizing proxy servers and offshore holding companies to mask the bleeding of federal funds. I inserted the flash drive into the terminal port. The screen flickered to life. Jamal's secondary administrator credentials functioned flawlessly. The first layer of Richard's firewall evaporated. I began typing, my fingers flying across the keyboard with muscle memory honed over years of being Richard's obedient accountant. I entered the master passwords, bypassed the secondary biometric checks, using Jamal's static IP overrides, and tore down the final encrypted barricade protecting the flagship clinic's air-gapped server farm. The screen flooded with data. It was not a trickle. It was a massive, undeniable tidal wave of raw, unedited corporate criminality. I split the screen, projecting the internal ledgers onto the monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I began mapping the architecture of the fraud for the 2 agents. I showed them exactly how Richard operated. The data stretched back a full decade, establishing a clear, uninterrupted pattern of systemic racketeering. I pulled up the Medicare billing codes. Richard had established a network of phantom patients. Zenith Healthcare was routinely billing the government for high-end complex surgical procedures that never actually occurred. I cross-referenced the billing dates with the forged patient intake signatures, proving the individuals were either deceased or entirely fabricated. Vance leaned forward, his eyes tracking the scrolling columns of stolen money. I highlighted the prescription drug logs. The clinics were ordering massive quantities of highly restricted narcotics, billing them to the phantom patients, and then diverting the inventory to the black market. Every single fraudulent transaction, every fabricated signature, and every illegal prescription was tied directly to Richard's personal authorization credentials. He had designed the system to blame me, but Jamal's flash drive contained the unredacted master logs. The digital fingerprints belonged entirely to Richard and Beverly. I did not stop there. I opened the offshore routing protocols demonstrating exactly how the stolen funds were laundered through Jamal's real estate holding companies before landing in the Cayman Island accounts. I linked the $50 million merger directly to the fraudulent revenue streams. Zenith Healthcare was not a legitimate medical provider. It was a massive, sophisticated money laundering syndicate operating under the guise of a corporate medical network. Agent Vance let out a low whistle, running a hand over his face. He had been building a circumstantial case for 3 years, struggling to find a single crack in Richard's armor. I had just handed him a watertight, fully documented, undeniable federal case wrapped in a digital bow. There were no loopholes left. There was no plausible deniability. The evidence was absolute, granular, and perfectly preserved. Miller pulled out his radio, his posture shifting from investigative observation to immediate tactical execution. He looked at the scrolling evidence and then turned his sharp gaze toward me. The tension in the room was electric. The hunt was over and the federal machinery was ready to strike. "This is a total kill shot," Agent Miller stated, his voice tight with adrenaline. "We have enough here to secure a dozen federal indictments. We can pull the tactical units right now. The signing for the corporate merger is scheduled for 9 o'clock this morning. It is currently 4:30. Do you want us to send the strike teams to their private residences and arrest them in their beds right now?" I stared at the glowing screen. I thought about the years of cruel manipulation, the endless condescension, and the cold way Richard and Beverly raised me to be their sacrificial lamb. I remembered Beverly slapping me in the Diamond Ballroom. I pictured Richard abandoning Preston without a thought, secure in his arrogance, believing his $50 million deal washed away his sins. Arresting them in the quiet dark of their mansions was too kind. It offered them privacy. It offered them a shield from the public humiliation they had so gleefully weaponized against everyone else. I closed the laptop with a sharp, echoing snap. I looked directly into Agent Miller's eyes. My expression was pure ice. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any mercy. "Call off the residential strike teams. Let them wake up. Let them put on their bespoke suits and designer dresses. Let them drive to the corporate headquarters and walk into that boardroom. I want them to smell the money. I want them to hold the pens. I want them to think they have won." The harsh fluorescent lighting of the federal staging facility was a stark contrast to the soft morning sun, now filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive lounge I had secured just blocks away from the financial district. I stood before the pristine vanity mirror, my fingers deftly adjusting the crisp knot of my silk tie. The face looking back at me was familiar, yet entirely changed. The exhaustion of the past 36 hours, the violent physical struggle in the parking garage, the intense hours of data decryption alongside the federal agents, none of it showed. My posture was rigid. My eyes were sharp dark and utterly devoid of the desperate need for validation that had plagued my entire childhood. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, verifying my armor for the final execution. I had left Agent Miller and Agent Vance coordinating the massive tactical deployment in their subterranean bunker. By now, the cyber division of the FBI would be silently locking down every domestic and offshore account tied to Richard and Beverly. The IRS would be freezing the corporate assets of Zenith Healthcare, tracing the illegal narcotic sales and the fabricated Medicare billing straight back to my parents' personal portfolios. The trap was set spring-loaded and entirely invisible to the targets. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, the sharp, cheerful chime of an incoming text message shattered the quiet of the lounge. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. The screen illuminated brightly with a message from Beverly. I stared at the notification, fascinated by the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the woman who gave birth to me. Even now, on what she believed was the morning of her ultimate triumph, she could not resist twisting the knife. She needed to assert her dominance one final time. I swiped the screen open and read the words. "We are putting the pen to paper in 1 hour. After today, I am buying the building your penthouse is in, and I will personally evict you onto the street. Goodbye, failure." A year ago, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. It would have triggered the deep-seated conditioning that demanded, I apologize, accommodate, and beg for her mercy. I would have agonized over how to fix the unfixable, how to appease her insatiable need for control. Today, reading those vicious words, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling amusement. Beverly was threatening to weaponize wealth that no longer belonged to her. She was bragging about a future funded by phantom patients and a money laundering syndicate, an empire that was currently evaporating bite by bite on federal servers. I did not reply. There was no need for a witty retort or a dramatic warning. The time for words had passed. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air of the lounge. I pocketed my phone, savoring the solid weight of it against my hip, and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. It no longer held the explosive master files; those were safely in federal custody, forming the foundation of a massive racketeering indictment, but it remained the physical symbol of my independence. I walked out of the lounge and onto the bustling pavement of the financial district. The city was wide awake, a canyon of glass and steel echoing with the sounds of morning traffic and the hurried footsteps of thousands of professionals. The crisp morning air bit at my cheeks, sharpening my senses. I blended seamlessly into the crowd of executives, just another suited professional heading toward a high-stakes meeting. But I was not carrying quarterly reports or marketing projections. I was carrying the complete and total destruction of the Zenith healthcare dynasty. Every step I took toward the city's tallest financial skyscraper felt lighter than the last. I was walking away from a lifetime of being the scapegoat, the forgotten daughter, the punchline to Beverly's cruel jokes, and the acceptable collateral damage in Richard's ruthless corporate games. I had systematically dismantled their golden boy in the basement of my building, handing Preston over to the authorities, wrapped in his own violent desperation and multiple felony charges. Richard had abandoned Preston without a second thought, discarding him to protect the pristine image required for this morning. Now it was time to address the architects of my misery. The skyscraper loomed ahead, a massive monolith of reflective glass and polished chrome that dominated the city skyline. It was the headquarters of the international investment firm backing Richard's $50 million merger. This was the temple where my parents came to worship money and power. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and entered the cavernous marble lobby. The space was intimidating by design, echoing with hushed conversations and the clicking of expensive leather shoes. Security guards stood at strict attention near the sleek biometric turnstiles. I bypassed the main reception desk, flashing the temporary visitor credential I had acquired through an old corporate contact. The guard nodded respectfully, allowing me passage into the inner sanctum of the elevator bank. I approached the designated lift for the executive penthouse levels. I stepped into the sleek glass elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft, expensive hiss, sealing me inside the transparent capsule. Through the glass walls, the bustling lobby floor began to shrink rapidly as the high-speed elevator shot upward. My reflection ghosted over the sprawling cityscape, revealing itself through the exterior windows. I watched the morning traffic become tiny ribbons of light. I watched the world they thought they owned spread out below. The digital floor indicator above the door climbed with relentless speed, eating away the distance separating me from the executive boardroom. The digital display above the elevator doors shifted rapidly, the numbers climbing higher as the sleek glass capsule shot toward the 60th floor. Below me, the morning rush hour traffic was reduced to tiny, meaningless ribbons of light snaking through the financial district. For 30 years, Richard and Beverly had operated on this elevated plane, looking down on the rest of the world, convinced that their wealth and status made them entirely untouchable. I watched my reflection in the polished glass. I was no longer the obedient daughter desperate for a fraction of their conditional love. I was the architect of their impending destruction. The elevator chimed a soft melodic note, and the heavy steel doors slid silently apart. I stepped out into the sprawling reception area of Vanguard Horizon Partners. The private equity firm was a fortress of white marble, frosted glass, and ruthless corporate power. This was the exact location where Richard intended to secure his $50 million lifeline. I bypassed the main reception desk entirely. I did not need an appointment, and I certainly did not need to wait. I flashed a highly specialized federal credential to the armed security detail flanking the executive corridor. The guard stepped aside, instantly granting me unimpeded access to the inner sanctum. My heels clicked with a steady metronomic rhythm against the pristine marble floor, echoing loudly in the hushed, pressurized atmosphere of the executive wing. At the far end of the corridor stood the main boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating chamber enclosed entirely in thick, soundproof glass, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. I did not pause. I walked straight toward the transparent walls, taking a moment to observe the scene unfolding inside before making my presence known. Richard sat at the head of the sprawling mahogany table, radiating an aura of absolute manufactured dominance. His bespoke suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled to project the image of a seasoned, reliable healthcare mogul. Beside him sat Beverly, draped in designer silk, wearing her signature mask of the flawless corporate matriarch. Next to her was Whitney. My sister looked completely shattered. Her posture was slumped, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She kept dabbing at her face with a monogrammed handkerchief, clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of composure after Preston had been publicly humiliated, physically destroyed, and dragged away in federal handcuffs just hours prior. Richard and Beverly were ignoring her distress entirely, their attention fixated exclusively on the money. Sitting across from my family was Marcus Sterling, the ruthlessly efficient CEO of Vanguard Horizon Partners. A thick leather-bound folder rested on the table between them containing the final merger contracts. Marcus held a solid gold fountain pen hovering just inches above the signature line. The $50 million transaction was literally seconds away from execution. Richard's eyes were locked onto that pen, a hungry, desperate anticipation radiating from his rigid posture. I grabbed the heavy chrome handles of the double doors and pushed them open with enough force to send them crashing against the interior walls. The heavy acoustic seal broke, and the hushed, tense atmosphere of the boardroom shattered instantly. 4 heads snapped in my direction. Whitney let out a sharp, terrified gasp, physically recoiling in her plush leather chair as if she had seen a ghost. Beverly's perfectly sculpted smile dissolved into an expression of absolute horror. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white. She clearly remembered the vicious text message she had sent me just 1 hour prior, boasting about my impending eviction and calling me a failure. Her eyes darted from me to the CEO, panic finally overriding her arrogance. Richard erupted. He shot up from his seat, his heavy leather chair skidding backward across the carpet. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of crimson, the polished mask of the healthcare visionary vanishing entirely. He was replaced by the vicious, controlling tyrant I had known my entire life. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, his chest heaving with unrestrained fury. "Call building security right now!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "How did she get up here? Remove this woman immediately. She is a disgruntled former employee who is actively attempting to sabotage this company. Get her out of my sight before I have her arrested for corporate espionage." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I walked calmly into the room, my posture straight, holding my leather briefcase loosely at my side. I looked directly at Richard, letting the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds, allowing his unchecked panic to fill the pristine corporate space. "You seem a little tense for a man about to sign the deal of a lifetime, Richard," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly controlled. Beverly found her voice stepping out from behind Richard's shadow, her face twisted with pure venom. "You have lost your mind, Stella." Beverly hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "This is a private corporate meeting. You are trespassing in a secure building. I warned you this morning. You are entirely finished in this city. I will see you financially ruined and living on the street for this stunt." I ignored her completely, shifting my gaze to the man sitting at the opposite end of the table. Marcus Sterling had not moved to call security. He had not reached for the panic button under the desk. He had not shown a single ounce of surprise or outrage at my dramatic entrance. Instead, he calmly placed the gold fountain pen down on the polished wood and closed the leather-bound contract folder with a soft, definitive thud. Marcus stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a relaxed, practiced motion. He looked at Richard, then at Beverly before turning his gaze to me. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a look of total professional respect that made Richard's jaw drop in confusion. "Richard, please sit down," Marcus said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, slicing cleanly through my father's manufactured outrage. "You haven't properly greeted our lead external auditor." The absolute silence that followed Marcus Sterling's introduction was heavy enough to crush bone. The smug, entitled fury completely vanished from Richard's face, replaced instantly by a sickly, ashen pallor. Beside him, Beverly looked as though the floor had simply dropped out from beneath her designer heels. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound emerged. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a painted mask on a ghost. Whitney just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, shrinking further into her oversized leather chair, realizing that the sister she had spent a lifetime mocking was now holding the reins of their entire existence. I walked toward the head of the sprawling mahogany table with deliberate, measured steps. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my approach, adding to the surreal, suspended reality of the boardroom. Marcus gestured gracefully toward the sophisticated audiovisual console embedded in the center of the table. I unclasped my briefcase, pulled out my laptop, and set it down. I retrieved the HDMI cable and slotted it cleanly into the port. The satisfying metallic click of the connection seemed to finally break the spell paralyzing my family. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically above his silk tie. "Marcus, there has been a monumental misunderstanding here," Richard stammered, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. His tone was thin, desperate, and pleading. "This woman is a disgruntled ex-employee. She has a personal vendetta against my family. You cannot possibly allow her to spearhead an audit of this magnitude. She is entirely compromised." Marcus did not even look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the massive 100-inch monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom, waiting for my screen to project. Vanguard Horizon. "Partners does not rely on misunderstandings," Richard Marcus replied smoothly, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We rely on granular data, and your daughter has provided us with the most comprehensive risk assessment I have seen in my entire career. Please, Stella, proceed." I tapped the keyboard. The wall monitor flickered to life, illuminating the dim boardroom with the harsh, undeniable glare of digital truth. The screen split into 4 organized quadrants, each one displaying a different facet of the Zenith Healthcare criminal enterprise. I turned away from the monitor and looked directly at my mother. "For 30 years, you made sure I knew exactly where I stood in this family," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the room. "You called me an ugly, dry bookworm. You told me I possessed no vision, no charisma, and no talent for real business. You laughed at my accounting degree and told me I was only fit to hide in the back office while you and Richard built an empire." Beverly opened her mouth to speak, but her voice failed her entirely. She gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white, her gaze darting frantically between me and the damning documents projected on the wall behind me. "But my boring skills just saved this firm from buying a $20 million hidden debt and a federal indictment," I stated, turning my attention to Richard. I tapped a key, maximizing the first quadrant of the screen. The monitor flooded with internal ledgers cross-referenced with Cayman Island routing numbers. "You came here today to secure $50 million from Vanguard Horizon under the guise of an expansion merger." I continued, pacing slowly behind my laptop. "But Zenith Healthcare is not expanding. It is imploding. You owe $20 million to a network of offshore shell companies that you created to hide your mounting operational losses. You structured the debt to remain entirely invisible to standard auditing procedures, planning to use Vanguard's injection capital to quietly pay off your own fraudulent loans." Richard's face contorted with panic. He looked at Marcus, raising his hands in a gesture of frantic denial. "Marcus, this is fabricated. She hacked our servers and altered the data. This is a targeted cyber attack." I ignored his desperate flailing and tapped the keyboard again. The second quadrant expanded. It displayed a scrolling list of thousands of patient names, dates of birth, and billing codes. "This is the flagship clinic's Medicare billing log," I explained, looking at Marcus, who was nodding slowly as he reviewed the data he had already previewed with me earlier that morning. Over the past decade, Richard and Beverly established a highly sophisticated network of phantom patients. They have been billing the federal government for complex, high-risk surgical procedures and long-term rehabilitative care for individuals who do not exist or who have been deceased for years. Whitney let out a small, choked sob. She looked at her parents, the reality of their wealth finally crashing down around her. "You told me the company was fine, Dad," she whimpered. "You said today was going to fix everything with Preston." The mention of her golden boy brought a cold smile to my lips. I tapped the spacebar one final time. The screen shifted to display high-resolution scans of internal authorization forms. The signatures of Richard and Beverly were clearly visible at the bottom of every single page, authorizing the fraudulent billing and the illegal transfer of restricted narcotics. "There is no fixing this," I said, staring directly into Richard's eyes. "Every single fraudulent transaction, every fake signature, every phantom patient, and every diverted narcotic shipment is tied directly to your personal biometric credentials. The master logs are unredacted. The data has already been verified. Vanguard Horizon is not looking at a lucrative medical acquisition today. They are looking at a massive systemic racketeering syndicate." Richard stared at the glowing monitor. He saw the offshore accounts laid bare. He saw the forged Medicare claims. He saw the undeniable proof of his own fake signatures. The illusion of his untouchable corporate empire shattered completely. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was not walking out of this building with a $50 million check. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. The realization snapped whatever remaining thread of sanity he possessed. A guttural, animalistic roar tore from his throat. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged violence. He shoved his heavy leather chair aside and lunged across the wide mahogany table, his hands reaching frantically for my laptop, desperate to smash the machine that was projecting his demise. He never made it halfway across the wood. The two armed security guards flanking the boardroom doors moved with terrifying speed. Before Richard could even grasp the edge of my computer, the guards crashed into him. They grabbed his tailored shoulders, hauling him backward with brutal efficiency. Richard thrashed and shouted, kicking out against the table, but the guards forced him down, slamming him back into his chair and pinning his arms firmly behind his back. Beverly shrieked, jumping out of her seat and pressing herself against the glass wall of the boardroom, horrified by the physical violence erupting in the pristine space. Whitney buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Marcus Sterling remained standing at the opposite end of the table, entirely unbothered by the chaos. He looked down at the struggling, red-faced man pinned to the chair. Then Marcus reached out and picked up the thick, leather-bound contract. He held the $50 million agreement up for Richard to see. With a single fluid motion, Marcus tore the heavy document straight down the middle. He placed the shredded halves together and tore them again, letting the pieces of Richard's final hope flutter uselessly onto the polished mahogany table. Agent Miller stared at me for a long moment, the tactical radio still clutched tightly in his hand. He absorbed the absolute finality in my voice, reading the cold, strategic calculation in my eyes. A slow, respectful nod followed. He lowered the radio, officially calling off the residential raid. The federal agents would hold their positions, waiting for my explicit signal to execute the takedown inside the corporate walls of the private equity firm. Arresting them in their sleep was a mercy they had never earned. They needed to fall from the very peak of their arrogance. I packed my laptop away, securing the decrypted flash drive in the inner pocket of my briefcase. I thanked the agents for their unprecedented efficiency and walked out of the subterranean federal bunker, stepping out into the quiet pre-dawn air of the financial district. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint metallic scent of the waking city. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of my penthouse, the heat from a ceramic mug of black coffee warming my palms. 60 floors below the financial district was already pulsing with the frantic energy of a new trading day. A year ago, I would have looked down at those streets and felt the crushing weight of Richard and Beverly's expectations pressing against my chest. Today, I looked down and felt nothing but absolute crystalline peace. This was the exact penthouse Beverly had viciously promised to buy out from under me. Now the deed was entirely in my name, paid for in cash from the massive whistleblower bounty the federal government had awarded me for dismantling the largest Medicare fraud syndicate in a decade. Through the open sliding glass doors, the crisp, professional voice of a morning news anchor drifted from the television mounted in my living room. I turned slightly, letting the cool breeze catch my hair, and listened to the final chapter of the Zenith healthcare dynasty being broadcast to the world. In a landmark sentencing this morning at the federal courthouse, the anchor announced a graphic of Zenith's shattered corporate logo flashing on the screen. Former healthcare moguls Richard and Beverly Preston were each handed maximum sentences of 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The couple, once considered royalty within the city's financial elite, sat in stunned silence as the judge condemned their decade-long orchestration of systemic racketeering, money laundering, and Medicare fraud. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me. The broadcast shifted, displaying courtroom sketches of my parents. The artist had captured the exact moment their arrogance finally broke. Richard looked hollowed out, a deflated shell of the tyrant who used to command boardrooms through sheer intimidation. Beverly's sketch showed her weeping, her flawless mask of social superiority permanently destroyed by the reality of a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The federal government had systematically seized everything. Their offshore accounts, their sprawling mansions, their luxury fleets, all of it liquidated to pay back the millions they had stolen. They were left with absolutely nothing but the brutal reality of a concrete cell. The sentencing marks the end of a sweeping federal investigation, the anchor continued seamlessly. Their son, former Zenith executive Preston, is currently serving a concurrent 8-year sentence in a medium-security facility following his conviction for aggravated assault and severe bankruptcy fraud. Authorities state that Preston attempted to violently suppress the whistleblower who ultimately brought down the family empire. I ran a finger along the smooth rim of my coffee mug, recalling the frantic, violent struggle in the parking garage. Preston had believed his physical strength and his unearned sense of entitlement would save him. The federal penal system had quickly taught him otherwise. His golden boy status held zero currency in a cell block. The news report transitioned to collateral damage, briefly mentioning the stunning social fall of my sister Whitney. When the FBI raided the Vanguard Horizon boardroom, Whitney had collapsed into hysterics, begging Jamal to protect her, to use his wealth to shield her from the fallout. But Jamal had executed his own exit strategy with surgical precision. He had secured full federal immunity by turning over the encrypted offshore server passwords, ensuring his own holding companies remained entirely untouched by the asset seizures. While Whitney sobbed in the boardroom, Jamal had coldly handed her a manila envelope containing heavily expedited divorce papers. He kept the house, the cars, and his freedom, quietly moving out of state to start over without a single backward glance. Whitney, stripped of her stolen trust fund, her designer wardrobe, and the weaponized prestige of the Zenith name, had been left entirely destitute. Just last week, an old corporate contact had sent me a grainy cell phone picture. It showed Whitney wearing a stiff polyester uniform, working the checkout register at a local discount store on the outskirts of the city. She was struggling to scan a barcode, her face pale under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, ringing up cheap groceries for the very people she used to gleefully mock. It was a brutal, poetic justice. I turned away from the balcony, stepping back into the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. The television hummed in the background, moving on to the weather forecast, leaving the ghosts of my family behind. I walked past the living room and stepped into my new, expansive home office. The space was a testament to clarity and order. Polished oak, gleaming glass, and walls of high-powered servers humming with encrypted data. I stopped in front of the wall near my mahogany desk. Mounted perfectly at eye level was a gleaming, heavy brass plaque, Stella Forensic Financials. I reached out and traced the engraved lettering. For 30 years, I had desperately craved their validation. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn their love, trying to prove that I was worthy of a seat at their toxic table. I had endured the condescension, the financial abuse, and the psychological warfare, believing that someday they would see my value. But they never would have. They were incapable of it. I smiled, a genuine, deeply satisfied expression that reached my eyes. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their conditional love, and I certainly didn't need their tainted, blood-soaked inheritance. I had taken their empire, broken it down to the bare studs, and used the wreckage to build my own. My firm was now the most sought-after independent auditing agency on the Eastern Seaboard, hired by massive corporate boards to ruthlessly hunt down the exact kind of financial parasites my parents had been. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the apex predator. The sleek multi-line phone on my desk suddenly lit up, trilling with a crisp, urgent ring. I glanced at the caller ID display. It was the executive board of a major Fortune 500 company, my newest client calling to authorize a hostile internal audit. I set my coffee mug down on the coaster, walked around the mahogany desk, and settled into my high-backed leather chair. I picked up the receiver, my voice steady, professional, and entirely free. "Stella Forensic Financials," I answered. The screen fades to black.